bearing it beneath a relentless howling wind. Silas Thorne did not brace for impact. He simply gripped the
Rerouting
yoke
auxiliary
with the left
power!
hand that was
Shields
more
failing,
scarred
hold
than
on!
sheathing skin, and rode
Punching
the dying
through!
ship into the ice. The impact was a brutal, bone-jarring slam that rattled his teeth and snapped his head back against the pilot's chair. Sparks showered the cramped cockpit like a dying firework display. The primary monitor shattered. The hum of the quantum drive died, replaced by the terrifying absolute silence of a dead machine. Then came the cold. DePaul. It did not creep in. It slammed through the cracked viewport like a physical blow. The temperature gauge on his wrist display dropped so fast the liquid crystal froze mid-number. -60 degrees. Silas sat in the dark for a long moment. He tasted copper in his mouth. He smelled the bitter chemical tang of burning ozone and ruptured hydraulic lines. He looked down at his left hand. The thick, jagged scars running from his knuckles to his forearm were throbbing with a phantom heat. It was an old ache, the kind of ache that came from a memory of fire of a ruptured pressure valve and a 3-second hesitation that had cost a young apprentice his life. 3 seconds. That was all it took for the world to end. Silas unbuckled his harness. His joints popped stiff with age and the brutal deceleration. He was 58 years old. He was a mechanic, a man who had spent his life elbow deep in the grease and guts of deep space freighters. He was not a soldier. He was not an explorer. He was just a man who fixed broken things. And right now, his ship was broken beyond repair. He didn't reach for the emergency beacon. In this sector, pressing that button was just ringing a dinner bell for scavengers. Nobody from the United States Space Command patrolled this deep into the fringe. He was alone. Silas forced the heavy cockpit door open. The wind immediately knocked him to his knees. The snow was completely white, a blinding, swirling oblivion that cut at his face like shards of broken glass. He pulled his heavy parka tight, the synthetic fur collar already crusting with ice. He needed heat. He needed shelter. He needed them right now. He turned back to the smoking wreckage of his ship. The hull was crumpled like a discarded tin can. He climbed back inside the rear cargo bay, his heavy boots crunching on shattered composite plating. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried economy of motion. Panic was a luxury for the young. Silas only knew work. He found the secondary quantum heating core. It was a heavy cylindrical unit roughly the size of a small barrel. It was damaged, the outer casing dented, but the green indicator light was still pulsing faintly. It was bleeding warmth. Silas gripped a heavy plasma wrench from his surviving toolbox. His scarred left hand shook. It always shook when the adrenaline faded. He clamped his jaw shut, forcing the muscles in his arm to obey his will. He didn't curse. He just locked the wrench onto the mounting bolts and leaned his entire weight into it. The metal groaned, the bolt snapped free. He dragged the heavy core out of the wreckage, hauling a massive, jagged slab of hull plating along with it. The wind fought him for every inch. His breath plumed in the air, instantly freezing and falling as dust. He scanned the bleak horizon. Through the blinding whiteout, he saw a jagged shadow against the side of a glacier. A fissure. A cave. It took him 40 minutes to drag the equipment 200 yards. By the time he reached the mouth of the cave, he could not feel his fingers. His lungs burned with the icy air. But he did not stop. He dragged the heavy core deep into the rock formation, away from the biting edge of the wind. The cave was vast, smelling of ancient frost and undisturbed stone. Silas set the core down. He tapped the ignition sequence on the side of the cylinder. The core sputtered, whined, and finally caught. A low, throbbing hum filled the cavern. A dim, ambient orange glow bled from the vents, casting long, dancing shadows against the ice-slicked walls. The heat was weak, barely enough to push the temperature above freezing in a 10-foot radius, but it was the difference between life and death. Silas slumped against the cave wall, sliding down to the hard stone floor. He pulled off his heavy gloves. He rubbed his face, feeling the grit of grease and the sting of frostnip on his cheeks. He reached into his deep pocket and pulled out his only surviving ration bar. It was a dense, tasteless brick of compressed proteins and carbohydrates. He was about to tear the foil wrapper when the ambient orange light of the core flickered. Something was blocking the entrance of the cave. Silas stopped breathing. He didn't reach for the heavy wrench at his side. He didn't make a sound. He just looked up. A figure stood silhouetted against the blinding white storm outside. The sheer size of it defied human logic. It had to be 8 feet tall, entirely filling the jagged opening of the cavern. It stood on 2 legs, but the proportions were entirely alien. The figure stepped out of the wind and into the dim orange light of the heating core. Silas felt his heart hammer a heavy, steady rhythm against his ribs. It was a woman, or at least the alien equivalent of one. Her skin was a mesmerizing, iridescent copper, covered in fine interlocking scales that caught the light like polished armor. Her hair was thick, braided tightly back against an elongated skull the color of tarnished bronze. She wore battle armor, but it was shattered. The dark, heavy metal plating on her left side was torn open, exposing the copper scales beneath. A thick, viscous blue fluid, her blood was steadily dripping onto the cavern floor, sizzling faintly as it hit the frozen stone. In her right hand, she gripped a massive double-bladed spear. The weapon hummed with a lethal, low-frequency vibration. This was a Solarian. Silas knew the rumors. Everyone on the frontier knew the ghost stories. They were the apex predators of the Outer Rim, an empire of giants, proud, ruthless, and entirely intolerant of humanity. Her eyes found him. They were entirely gold-lacking pupils glowing with an intense predatory light. She raised the heavy spear, the razor-sharp tip pointing directly at Silas's chest. Her breathing was ragged, heavy. She was favoring her uninjured side. She was a titan, but she was dying. Silas looked at the spear, then he looked at her face. Behind the terrifying alien majesty, he saw something incredibly familiar. He saw the tight jaw. He saw the slight tremble in the arm holding the weapon. He saw the profound, crushing isolation of a creature that had been fighting alone for far too long. He didn't raise his hands in surrender. He didn't scramble backward. He simply sat perfectly still, his back against the cold cave wall. The silence between them stretched thick and heavy, broken only by the howling wind outside and the rhythmic drip of her blue blood onto the stone. She took a step forward. The spear tip hovered 2 feet from his throat. Silas looked down at the ration bar in his hands. He looked back up at her. He looked at the deep, ragged wound in her side. Slowly, deliberately making sure she could see every movement of his scarred left hand, Silas tore the foil wrapper open. He gripped the dense protein brick and snapped it directly in half. The sharp crack echoed in the cave. He tossed one half of the bar through the air. It landed on the stone floor exactly halfway between them. The alien woman flinched, her golden eyes snapping down to the small piece of food, then instantly back to his face. The spear did not lower. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of copper scales and rigid discipline. Silas didn't say a word. He didn't offer a comforting smile. He knew better. A smile to an apex predator was a baring of teeth. It was a challenge. Instead, he simply looked away. He turned his shoulder to her, deliberately exposing his unprotected back. He picked up his heavy plasma wrench, dragged the jagged slab of hull plating he had hauled from the ship, and positioned it between the heating core and the cave entrance. He began to work. The alien stood frozen. She watched this tiny, fragile, soft-skinned creature ignore her completely. He possessed no weapons. He possessed no armor. He was trapped in a dead end with a warrior of the Solarian royal bloodline. Yet he had surrendered half of his survival resources without a single demand. Zalara, queen of the Solarian Empire, lowered her spear by a fraction of an inch. She was hunted. Her own commander's men, who had sworn blood oaths to her lineage, had betrayed her. They had ambushed her royal transport. They had slaughtered her guard. She had fought her way into an escape pod, bleeding broken, crashing onto this frozen wasteland. She expected to die here. She expected to be tracked down and executed like a wounded animal. She did not expect a human mechanic to throw her a piece of bread and turn his back. Her vision blurred. The pain in her side was a roaring fire. Her knees buckled, the sheer mass of her 8-foot frame crashing heavily to the stone floor. The spear clattered from her grip. Silas stopped working. He looked over his shoulder. She was slumped against the cavern wall 3 meters away. She was breathing in short, shallow gasps. Her eyes were half closed, but she was still watching him, still waiting for the trap to spring. She was a ruler. She knew that nothing in this universe was free. Every act of kindness was a transaction. Every gift was a debt. Silas turned back to his work. He adjusted the heavy hull plating. The wind was still cutting into the cavern, swirling the freezing air and sucking the warmth away from the dying core. He needed to build a baffle. He needed to focus the heat. He raised the heavy plasma wrench. He brought it down on the edge of the metal plating. Clank. The sound was sharp, metallic, purposeful. He adjusted his grip. He brought the wrench down again, bending the thick composite metal. Clank. He wasn't trying to be quiet. He wasn't trying to be soothing. He was just doing his job. He was fixing the environment. Zylara watched him through heavy golden eyelids. The cold was seeping into her bones. Her species ran hot. Their internal core temperatures were massive, requiring constant energy. In this freezing environment, her body was rapidly shutting down. She looked at the piece of human food resting on the stone near her hand. It was pathetic. It was small. It smelled faintly of synthetic dust. Her stomach violently twisted. She reached out with trembling, scaled fingers. She picked it up. She didn't sniff it. She didn't inspect it for poison. She simply shoved it into her mouth and swallowed it whole. It was dense, heavy, and sat in her stomach like a lead weight. But it was fuel. She looked back at the human. He hadn't watched her eat. He was entirely focused on the metal. Clank, he brought the wrench down. The metal bent further, curving inward, catching the orange glow of the heating core and reflecting it back into the small pocket of space they occupied. Clank. The rhythm was incredibly steady. It was the rhythm of a man who had swung a hammer 1,000,000 times. It was the sound of competence. It was the sound of a universe that made sense, where broken things could be mended and cold things could be warmed. Zalara shifted her weight. Her side screamed in agony. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her massive arms around her legs, trying to conserve whatever heat she had left. The blue blood had stopped dripping. The extreme cold was coagulating the wound, freezing it shut. A brutal, agonizing tourniquet of ice. She was a queen. From the moment she was born into the royal broods, she had been surrounded by thousands. Guard servants, sycophants, assassins. Every person who had ever approached her wanted something. They wanted her favor, her power, her resources, or her life. She had never been alone, and she had never been safe. Now she was trapped in a frozen tomb at the edge of the galaxy, sitting 3 meters away from a creature her people considered barely sentient. And yet, the ambient temperature in the cavern was rising. The curved metal plate the human had fashioned was trapping the heat from the core. A pocket of stagnant, lukewarm air began to settle over them. Silas put the wrench down. He wiped his greasy forehead with the back of his sleeve. He leaned back against his side of the metal baffle, stretching his legs out. He looked across the small orange-lit space. Zylara was watching him. Her golden eyes were luminous in the dim light. She looked like a cornered dragon. Silas reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, battered metal flask. He unscrewed the cap. He took a short, measured pull of the harsh, synthetic whiskey inside. It burned all the way down, settling like a coal in his chest. He wiped the mouth of the flask with his thumb. He held it out toward her. Zylara stared at the small metal container. She didn't move. Silas didn't press the issue. He didn't wave it at her. He simply set the flask down on the stone, exactly halfway between them, right where the ration bar had been. Then he pulled his parka tight around his neck, crossed his arms over his chest, and closed his eyes. Zylara watched him for a long, long time. The human's breathing slowed. His chest rose and fell in a steady, deep rhythm. He was actually going to sleep. He was exposing his throat to her. He was either the most foolish creature in the cosmos, or he possessed a kind of quiet strength she had never encountered before. The cold wind outside the cavern howled a desperate, angry sound that wanted to strip the flesh from their bones. But inside the small, metal-shielded pocket, the air was still. The orange light pulsed like a slow heartbeat. Zylara slowly reached out. Her long, scaled arms stretched across the stone. Her heavy fingers closed around the small metal flask. It was warm from his hands. She brought it to her face. She smelled the sharp, volatile liquid inside. It smelled like industrial solvent. It smelled terrible. She took a drink. The liquid was liquid fire. It burned a path down her throat, searing her chest, flooding her freezing veins with an aggressive artificial heat. She coughed, a deep, rumbling sound in her chest. She looked over at the human. He hadn't moved. He hadn't opened his eyes. Zylara set the flask down beside her. She pulled her knees tighter to her chest. The silence of the cave settled around them, thick and heavy. But it was no longer the silence of the grave. It was the silence of a truce. She rested her chin on her knees. She watched the slow rise and fall of the human's chest. She listened to the hum of the heating core. For the first time in her life, nobody was asking her for anything. Nobody was waiting for her orders. Nobody was plotting her demise. There was only the cold rock, the orange light, and the quiet, scarred man who had fixed the air. Slowly, against every instinct of a warrior and a queen, Xylara's heavy golden eyelids began to droop. The exhaustion of her escape, the massive blood loss, and the sudden, unexplainable sense of sanctuary washed over her in a dark wave. She closed her eyes. Outside, the storm raged, burying the wreckage of the human ship in the escape pod beneath feet of unforgiving ice. The universe continued its chaotic, violent spin. But deep beneath the surface, in a small pocket of borrowed heat, two entirely different species sat 3 meters apart, breathing the same air, surviving the same dark. And as the long, freezing night stretched on, Silas Thorne opened one eye. He watched the giant alien woman sleep. He saw the slow, rhythmic rise of her copper-scaled chest. He saw the tension leave her heavy shoulders. He didn't marvel at the historical significance of the moment. He didn't ponder the political ramifications of harboring a Solarian. He just looked at the blinking red light on the heating core, mentally calculating how many hours of battery life they had left. His left hand ached. He rubbed the thick scars with his right thumb, the ghost of a 3-second hesitation whispering in his ear. He had failed to save a life once. He had carried the weight of that failure across the star, burying himself in grease, in engines, trying to fix machines because machines made sense. Machines could be repaired. He looked back at the sleeping giant. She was broken. He was broken. Silas closed his eyes again. The hum of the core filled his ears. Tomorrow they would need more heat. Tomorrow they would need water. Tomorrow the people who had hurt her might come looking for her. But tonight the wind was blocked. The air was warm. Silas Thorne let out a long, slow breath, letting his chin rest against his chest. For the first time in a very long time, the mechanics slept without dreaming of the fire. The orange glow of the quantum heating core did not fade slowly. It died with a sharp mechanical click that echoed like a gunshot in the cavern. Instantly, the darkness rushed in, dragging the absolute paralyzing cold of the ice planet with it. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that Silas could hear the moisture in his own breath crackle and freeze before it hit the stone floor. He didn't curse. He didn't panic. He simply reached into the dark, his fingers tracing the familiar neural grip of his plasma wrench by pure muscle memory. He crawled forward on his knees until his chest bumped against the dead metal casing of the core. The metal was already leaching its residual warmth into the frozen air. Silas flicked on a small, blue-tinted shoulder lamp attached to his parka. The narrow beam cut through the dark, illuminating the access panel of the heater. He needed to bypass the thermal regulator. It was a crude, dangerous fix, the kind that could turn the core into a localized plasma bomb if left unchecked, but freezing to death was a much more immediate certainty. Silas gripped the wrench in his left hand. He jammed the heavy tool onto the primary locking nut. He braced his boots against the stone and pulled. Nothing happened. The cold had already seeped into his joints. The thick, jagged scars running up his left forearm, the legacy of superheated steam, and a lifetime of regret seized violently. The muscle tissue contracted into a rigid, agonizing knot. His hands shook. It wasn't a slight tremor. It was a violent, uncontrollable spasm. The wrench slipped from the nut, tearing a strip of skin from his knuckles. The heavy steel tool clattered against the stone floor, sliding away into the shadows. Silas let out a short, sharp breath through his teeth. He clenched his left fist, trying to force the blood, back into the deadened nerves, trying to beat the biology of an aging, broken body into submission. He reached for the wrench again. His fingers wouldn't open. The scar tissue had locked his hand into a useless, trembling claw. He sat back on his heels, his breath pluming in the blue light. He stared at his ruined hand. For a man who had spent 40 years fixing the universe, there was no greater defeat than a body that refused to work. A shadow moved across his shoulder lamp. Xylara did not make a sound as she crossed the cavern floor. Despite her massive 8-foot frame, despite the heavy shattered combat armor hanging from her shoulders, she moved with the silent predatory grace of a creature born to hunt in the dark. She knelt beside him. The sheer mass of her displaced the freezing air. Silas didn't look up. He kept his eyes on the dead heating core, his jaw locked in a tight, bitter line. He waited for the judgment. He waited for the apex warrior to realize that her only ally was a crippled, aging mechanic who couldn't even turn a wrench. Zalara didn't look at the heating core. She looked at his trembling, scarred hand. Slowly, she reached out. Her hand was massive, easily twice the size of his. Her skin was covered in fine, interlocking copper scales that caught the dim blue light. She didn't grab the wrench. She didn't push him aside to fix the machine herself. She opened her large hand and placed it directly over his locked, trembling fist. The shock of it made Silas gasp. It wasn't just the touch, it was the heat. Solarian biology operated at a baseline core temperature of 115 degrees. To a human in a freezing cave, her touch felt like plunging his hand into a basin of hot, soothing water. The heat radiated from her copper scales, seeping instantly through his skin, melting the ice in his veins, and flooding the rigid seized muscles of his scars with a deep, penetrating warmth. Silas froze. He looked up. Her face was inches from his. Her golden, pupilless eyes were unreadable, reflecting the pale light of his shoulder lamp. She didn't say a word. She didn't offer a patronizing smile. She simply held his broken hand in hers, anchoring him to the physical world, pouring her own vital heat into his failing body. For 60 seconds, the only sound in the cave was the howling wind outside and the steady, heavy rhythm of her alien breathing. Slowly, the violent trembling in Silas's arm began to subside. The locked tendons in his hand relaxed, his fingers uncurled. Zylara withdrew her hand. The sudden absence of her heat left a cold ache in his skin. She reached down, picked up the heavy plasma wrench from the stone floor, and held it out to him by the handle. Silas looked at the tool. Then he looked at her. He took the wrench. His grip was steady. He turned back to the core. He locked the wrench onto the nut and threw his weight into it. The metal shrieked, gave way, and the access panel popped open. Silas bypassed the regulator, crossing two heavy-gauge copper wires. Sparks showered the stone. The core whined, coughed, and violently roared back to life. The dim orange glow flooded the cavern once again, pushing back the dark. The ambient temperature immediately began to climb. Silas sat back, wiping a smear of grease and blood from his cheek. Zylara was already moving back to her side of the metal baffle, settling her massive frame against the rock wall. The physical gap between them had opened again, but the vast empty space of the universe had just gotten a little bit smaller. 2 hours later, the adrenaline of the repair faded, leaving behind the hollow, gnawing ache of absolute exhaustion and hunger. Silas opened his battered survival kit. He bypassed the medical supplies and pulled out a single dented aluminum tin. It was a United States Space Command standard-issue emergency ration. Meat stew, it had a shelf life of 50 years and tasted exactly like the tin it was housed in. He popped the seal. He didn't have a stove, so he simply set the metal tin directly onto the flat, heated casing of the quantum core. Within minutes, the thick, gelatinous block inside began to bubble. The smell hit the air almost immediately. It was a pungent, aggressively artificial odor of synthesized protein, heavy sodium, and stale grease. It smelled like a wet dog wrapped in old copper wire. Silas pulled the tin off the heat with a rag. He grabbed a single-stamped metal spoon from his kit. He looked across the orange-lit space. Zylara was watching him. Her golden eyes were tracking the tin of food with the intense predatory focus of a starving animal, though her posture remained rigidly disciplined. Silas didn't eat. He stood up, walked the 3 meters across the stone, and held the tin out to her. Zylara looked at the offering. Her alien pride waged a brief, silent war against her biology. Biology won. She took the tin in her large copper fingers wrapping around the heated metal. She took the small human spoon. She looked down at the bubbling gray-brown sludge. Silas walked back to his side of the fire and sat down, resting his forearms on his knees. He watched her. Zylara scooped a generous portion of the stew onto the spoon. She brought it to her mouth. She didn't hesitate. She swallowed it. For 2 seconds, her face remained a mask of stoic royal dignity. Then the flavor registered. Her massive shoulders locked. Her golden eyes widened to twice their normal size. The copper scales along her jawline flared outward in a biological display of pure, unadulterated shock. Her majestic, terrifying alien face contorted into an expression of absolute, unfiltered revulsion. She looked as though she had just swallowed a live, highly acidic grenade. She forced the sludge down her throat with a hard, painful swallow, her chest heaving as she suppressed a violent gag reflex. Silas stared at her. He looked at the empty spoon in her hand. He looked at the horrified expression on her face. Deep in Silas's chest, a pressure began to build. It was a strange foreign sensation. It bubbled up through the grime, the cold, and the decades of quiet, stoic isolation. He tried to bite it down, but he couldn't. A low, gravelly sound escaped his throat. It sounded like an engine trying to turn over in the cold. He put a hand over his mouth, turning his head away, but his shoulders began to shake. "I'm sorry." Silas choked out his voice thick with suppressed mirth. "I know, it's a crime against nature." Zylara glared at him. She looked at the tin of meat as if it were a weapon of mass destruction. Silas let his hand fall from his mouth. A genuine, unrestrained chuckle broke free. It was a rusty sound, a sound he hadn't made in years. "I had a coonhound back in Nevada." Silas rasped, a tired smile cracking the dirt on his face. "Meanest, ugliest dog you ever saw. Ate garbage. Ate a leather boot once. But if I put a can of USSC stew in his bowl..." Silas shook his head. He would have buried it in the dirt and walked away. Zylara continued to stare at him. The human was laughing. He was trapped on a hostile world, facing certain death, and he was laughing at his own miserable food. She looked down at the tin again. She thought of the intricate spiced delicacies of the Solarian royal court. She thought of the absolute absurdity of her situation. An apex predator, a queen of 1,000 worlds sitting in a cave eating dog food with a mechanic. A sound vibrated in her chest. It started low, a deep resonant hum that rattled the loose pebbles on the cave floor. Then her lips parted, revealing rows of sharp, slightly pointed teeth. Zylara laughed. It wasn't a delicate sound. It was a rich, booming, chest-deep bark of genuine amusement that filled the cavern. It was a sound of release. It was the sound of a heavy, suffocating armor finally cracking open. Silas looked up in his own laughter, fading into a quiet, profound awe. He watched the alien queen throw her head back, the tight braids of her copper hair shifting against her armor, the severe lines of her face softening into something incredibly breathtakingly beautiful. In that single shared moment of absolute absurdity, the vast cold expanse of the galaxy vanished. The millions of years of divergent evolution, the wars, the politics, the rigid boundaries of species and empire, they all burned away in the orange light of a broken heater. They were no longer human and Solarian. They were just two hungry, tired souls laughing in the dark. The laughter eventually subsided, leaving behind a comfortable, heavy warmth that had nothing to do with the quantum core. Zylara set the half-empty tin down on the stone. She leaned her back against the cave wall, extending her long legs toward the heat. Her golden eyes, now softer, more observant, drifted down to Silas's left arm. The sleeve of his parka was pushed up, revealing the thick, twisted ropes of scar tissue that wrapped from his knuckles to his elbow. The burns were ancient, faded to a dull, shiny white against his weathered skin, but they spoke of a horrific, violent trauma. Silas noticed her gaze. He didn't pull his sleeve down. He didn't hide it. He simply looked at his own hand, flexing the stiff fingers slowly. "Plasma burn," Silas said quietly, his voice losing the rough humor from moments before. The words felt heavy, dropping like stones into the quiet air of the cavern. Zylara didn't ask a question. She just listened, her golden eyes fixed on his face. 30 years ago. Silas continued staring at the orange glow of the heater. "I was a senior tech on a deep space mining rig out near the Jovian belt. Massive operation. Loud, dirty, dangerous." He rubbed his thumb over the thickest part of the scar on his wrist. "I had an apprentice, a kid from one of the outer colonies. Barely 19 years old, talked too much. Always asking questions, always trying to prove he belonged there." Silas swallowed hard. The memory tasted like ash. "We were doing routine maintenance on the primary coolant lines. I was on the main console. He was down in the trench working the manual bypass valves." The wind howled outside, a mournful counterpoint to the quiet, steady cadence of Silas's voice. "The pressure gauge on my board spiked, redlined in half a second." Silas's jaw tightened. The muscles in his neck stood out like cords of steel. "I knew the protocol. I knew I had to hit the emergency bulkhead release instantly. If I hit it, the trench seals." The kid gets trapped, but he lives. If I don't hit it, the line blows. Silas stopped talking. He stared into the fire. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. I hesitated, Silas whispered. He didn't look at Zalara. He couldn't. I looked at the gauge, and for 3 seconds I convinced myself it was a sensor malfunction. The kid was down there. I didn't want to lock him in the dark based on a faulty wire. I second-guessed the machine. Silas closed his eyes. 3 seconds. That's all it takes for superheated plasma to build critical mass. He opened his eyes, staring blankly at his scarred hand. The line ruptured. The blast hit the trench. I tried to reach the manual override lever. I got my hand on it just as the secondary wave hit the console. The heat melted the skin off my arm in a fraction of a heartbeat. But I didn't feel it. I couldn't feel anything over the sound of the alarms. Silas let his hand fall to his lap. The kid didn't make it. 3 seconds of hesitation. I thought I was being careful. I thought I was protecting him. Silas let out a harsh, bitter breath. Machines make sense. You read the dials, you turn the wrench, and the engine runs. People just break. He sat perfectly still, locked in the frozen prison of his own past. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't expect comfort. He was a man who had accepted his guilt a long time ago, carrying it like a stone in his pocket every single day of his life. He waited for the alien queen to judge him. He expected her to see his hesitation as weakness. Solarians did not tolerate failure in leadership. A commander who hesitated was a commander who was executed. But Zalara did not speak. Silas heard the soft scrape of armor against stone. He felt the air shift in the small space. He looked up. Zalara had moved. She had crossed the physical space between them. She was sitting directly beside him, her massive frame dwarfing his own. She smelled like ozone cold iron and something fiercely, uniquely biological. She didn't offer hollow words of comfort. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault. She was a warrior. She knew the absolute uncompromising brutality of command. She knew that guilt was a tax levied on those who survived. Instead, Zalara shifted her weight. She slowly, deliberately lowered her massive horned head. She rested her head heavily against Silas's right shoulder. Silas stopped breathing. The weight of her was immense, pressing him firmly against the rock wall. The heat radiating from her copper scales seeped through his heavy parka, sinking deep into his bones. It was an act of profound, unimaginable vulnerability. She was an apex predator, a hunted queen exposing her neck to a stranger. She was offering him the only thing she had left to give her quiet, absolute presence. Silas didn't move. He didn't dare break the fragile gravity of the moment. He let his head tilt slightly until his temple rested against the cool, smooth scales of her forehead. The wind screamed outside the cavern, but inside the air was perfectly still. The temperature in the cavern continued to rise. The curved metal baffle Silas had built was working too well, trapping the heat from the quantum core and combining it with the massive ambient thermal output of Zylara's alien biology. The air grew thick, heavy, and intensely warm. Silas felt a bead of sweat roll down the back of his neck. He unzipped his heavy parka, letting it fall open. Zalara shifted against him. Her breathing had changed. It was no longer the steady, measured rhythm of sleep. It was faster, deeper. Silas looked down. Zalara had lifted her head from his shoulder. She was looking at him. The dim orange light caught the sharp, predatory angles of her face, but her golden eyes were entirely different now. The guarded royal discipline was gone. In its place was something raw, primal, and overwhelmingly powerful. The tight, enclosed space. The extreme contrast of the freezing death outside and the suffocating heat inside. The sudden, violent shattering of their emotional isolation. It was triggering a biological imperative that neither of them fully understood. Solarians were solitary apex beings. They did not seek comfort. But when they found an anchor in the storm, they bound themselves to it with absolute terrifying intensity. Zalara raised her large copper-scaled hand. She didn't touch his scarred left arm. She reached for his right hand. She intertwined her massive fingers with his, the heat of her skin burning against his calluses. She leaned forward, her lips parted slightly. She didn't ask for permission, but her movement was slow enough to allow him to pull away. Silas didn't pull away. He had lived in the cold for 30 years. He had pushed everyone away, burying himself in the grease and the silence of deep space. But looking into the glowing golden eyes of the alien queen, he realized he didn't want to be cold anymore. He raised his scarred left hand. It didn't tremble. He placed his rough palm against the smooth heated scales of her cheek. When Zalara kissed him, it wasn't a gentle collision. It was a desperate, consuming fire. Her mouth was incredibly hot, tasting of copper and adrenaline. She pulled him against her armor, her massive strength easily overpowering him, but there was no violence in her grip, only a frantic, overwhelming need to close the distance to eradicate the space between them. Silas responded with an intensity he hadn't known he still possessed. His hands gripped the edges of her shattered armor, pulling her closer. The boundaries of species of empires of biology melted away in the suffocating heat of the cavern. They were two solitary creatures broken by their pasts, hunted by the universe, seeking the only undeniable truth. Left to them the desperate, fleeting warmth of another living soul in the dark. The quantum core hummed its steady rhythm, casting long, tangled shadows against the ancient ice bearing witness as the mechanic and the queen crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. When the faint pale light of the planet's distant sun finally began to bleed through the howling storm outside, Silas was already awake. The quantum heater was sputtering, running on the last dregs of its power cell. The air in the cavern was growing sharply cold again. Zalara was sleeping against the far wall. Her copper hair had come unbraided, spilling wildly over her shoulders. She looked peaceful, a stark contrast to the lethal warrior he had met the day before. Silas quietly gathered his tools, moving with practiced efficiency. He needed to find a way to tap the remaining power from his ship's emergency reserves before the heater died completely. He picked up his heavy parka from the stone floor. As he shook it out, something heavy clattered against the rock. Silas knelt down. It was a piece of solid polished metal the size of his palm. It was forged from pure iridium, impossibly heavy for its size. Intricate geometric patterns were etched into the surface, spiraling outward from a central raised emblem, a stylized multi-pointed star piercing a crown. It was the royal seal of the Solarian Empire. It must have fallen from a hidden pocket in Zalara's armor during the night. Silas stared at the emblem. He was a mechanic from the fringe, but he wasn't ignorant. He knew what that seal meant. He knew the face that was stamped on every standard-issue Imperial credit chip. He looked over at the sleeping woman. She wasn't just a Solarian commander. She was the absolute monarch of 1,000,000,000 souls, and she was hiding in a cave on a frozen rock. Silas didn't panic. He simply closed his scarred fist around the heavy iridium medallion, slipped it deep into his trouser pocket, and zipped it shut. He wouldn't ask. If she wanted him to know, she would tell him. He activated the small medical scanner on his wrist display. He needed to check the wound on her side before they attempted to move. He walked quietly over to her, keeping his distance so as not to wake her, and pointed the red targeting laser at her exposed flank. The scanner beeped. Silas looked at the readout on his wrist. He frowned. He tapped the side of the device, assuming the extreme cold had scrambled the sensors. He ran the scan again. The device emitted a rapid, high-pitched chime. The holographic readout hovered above his wrist. It wasn't registering an infection. It wasn't registering blood loss. It was registering massive, unprecedented cellular multiplication. The biological markers were spiking off the charts. The scanner identified the host DNA as Solarian, but it was also identifying a secondary, rapidly integrating genetic sequence, human DNA. Silas stopped breathing. He stared at the blue numbers scrolling across the screen. Exponential growth, accelerated gestation. The biology of the Solarian Queen was reacting to the human genetic material with a violent, terrifying efficiency, adapting, integrating, and evolving at a rate that defied every known law of medical science. She was pregnant, and the hybrid organism was developing in a matter of hours, not months. The atmospheric pressure in this cave is changing. Silas snapped his wrist down. Zalara was awake. She was sitting up, her golden eyes fixed entirely on his face. She hadn't been looking at the scanner. She had been looking at his expression. Silas didn't try to lie. He was a man of practical truths. He tapped his wrist display, transferring the holographic readout to project in the air between them. Zalara looked at the floating blue data. She understood medical telemetry. She didn't gasp. She didn't show fear. But the copper scales along her neck flushed a deep, vibrant crimson. She touched her stomach, her large fingers pressing lightly against her armor. Impossible, she whispered. The words sounded hollow in the vast cavern. Our genetic sequences are incompatible. The Imperial Science Division concluded decades ago that cross-species reproduction with humanity would result in 0% viability. Looks like your scientist forgot to carry a 1, Silas said quietly. His voice was remarkably steady. He wasn't looking at the data anymore. He was looking at her. Zylara raised her head. The soft, vulnerable woman from the night before vanished. The apex predator, the absolute monarch, returned to her eyes. The terrifying weight of her reality descended upon her shoulders. You know what this means, Zylara said, her voice dropping to a dangerous imperial resonance. It means my scanner isn't broken, Silas replied, keeping his tone perfectly neutral. It means I am carrying a biological anomaly that threatens the foundation of my entire civilization. Zylara countered, standing to her full towering height. The sheer presence of her filled the cave. My commanders did not betray me for political gain. They betrayed me because I refused to exterminate the human colonies on our borders. They believe humanity is a virus. If they discover that I carry a human child— She stopped. She looked down at Silas, the small, fragile, scarred mechanic who stood before her without a trace of fear. I am Zylara, she declared, her voice echoing off the stone. Queen of the Solarian Empire, and the armada that is currently hunting me will not simply kill us. They will burn this entire sector of space to ash to erase the evidence of what we have done. Silas Thorne stood perfectly still. He reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against the heavy iridium seal. He didn't bow. He didn't pledge his undying loyalty. He just looked at the blinking red light on the dying quantum heater. Well, Your Majesty, Silas said, his voice flat, practical, and entirely devoid of panic, then I suggest we figure out how to get my ship's comm array working. Because if we're going to start an interstellar war, I'd prefer not to do it on an empty stomach. The vibration began not in the air but deep within the bedrock of the ice planet. Silas Thorne felt it first in the soles of his boots. It was a rhythmic, mechanical thudding, a heavy, syncopated bass line that traveled through the frozen stone and resonated in the hollow of his chest. It was a sound he had heard 100 times on a dozen different frontier worlds. Repulsor engines, heavy military grade, and they were decelerating. Silas did not jump to his feet. He did not shout a warning. He simply set down the bundle of salvaged wiring he had been stripping. He looked at the mouth of the cavern. The howling whiteout of the storm was beginning to glow with an unnatural, sickly violet light. The searchlights of Solarian gunships were cutting through the blizzard, hunting for a ghost. He turned his head slowly. Zylara was already standing. The transformation was terrifying. The vulnerable, exhausted woman who had shared his miserable food and slept against his shoulder was gone. In her place stood the absolute monarch of 1,000,000,000 souls. She had strapped the broken remnants of her heavy combat armor back over her shoulders. She gripped the massive double-bladed spear in her right hand. But Silas saw what the armor was trying to hide. She was swaying. The violent, impossible biology raging inside her was consuming her alive. The accelerated gestation of the hybrid child was stripping the calcium from her bones and the iron from her blue blood to fuel its own explosive growth. Her copper scales had lost their iridescent luster, turning a dull ashen gray at the edges. Her breathing was a ragged, wet rasp. They found the thermal bloom of your heating core, Zylara said. Her voice was a strained, resonant whisper that echoed off the cavern walls. Silas didn't apologize. He reached down and picked up his heavy plasma wrench. The scarred flesh of his left hand throbbed, a dull ache radiating from the bone. How many? Silas asked, his voice calm, flat, and entirely devoid of fear. A vanguard detachment, Zylara replied, her golden eyes fixed on the violet light spilling into the cave entrance. 50 elite, heavily armored infantry, led by High Commander Vokhtar himself. He would not trust my execution to a subordinate. She turned her massive head to look at him. The sheer gravity of her presence pressed down on the small space. You will remain in the shadows at the rear of this cavern, human, she commanded. It was not a request. It was an imperial decree. When they breach the entrance, I will engage them. Vokhtar's arrogance will demand single combat. I will draw them out into the storm. When the perimeter is broken, you will run. You will find your ship's emergency beacon, and you will not look back. Silas looked at the spear in her hand. The blade was trembling. She barely had the strength to hold it upright, let alone fight 50 Solarian elites. "You're going to surrender," Silas stated. It wasn't a question. "I'm going to buy you time," Zylara corrected, her jaw tightening. "Vokhtar wants to parade my corpse through the capital to legitimize his coup. If he finds me sharing shelter with a human mechanic, he will not just kill you. He will keep you alive for a very, very long time to extract a confession of biological sabotage." She took a heavy, agonizing step toward the cave entrance. "I am the sovereign," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of an ancient, bloody lineage. "My life is forfeit to the Empire. Yours is not." Silas watched her broad, armored back. He saw the slight falter in her step. He remembered the feeling of her massive hand wrapping over his scarred, trembling fingers in the dark. He remembered the sudden, shocking sound of her laughter echoing over a tin of dog food. He had spent 30 years running from a ghost. He had spent 30 years letting a 3-second hesitation define the entire sum of his existence. He had told himself he was just a mechanic, a man who fixed broken valves and ignored a broken universe. Silas Thorne tightened his grip on the heavy steel wrench. "No," Silas said. The word was not shouted. It was spoken with the quiet, immovable density of a neutron star. Zylara stopped. She turned slowly, her golden eyes narrowing in disbelief. A human did not countermand a Solarian queen. Before she could swish, the rock wall beside the cave entrance exploded. The concussive wave of a plasma brimage charge threw Silas off his feet. He hit the stone hard, tasting blood and rock dust. The makeshift metal baffle he had built around the heating core was shredded into glowing shrapnel. Through the clearing smoke and settling ice, the hunters entered. They were giants clad in pristine matte black tactical armor that absorbed the violet light of the gunships outside. They moved with absolute terrifying synchronicity, fanning out into the cavern, their heavy pulse rifles raised and locked. And then Vokhtar stepped through the breach. The High Commander was a behemoth even among his own kind. He stood over 9 feet tall, his armor was etched with silver combat honors, and a heavy dark cape hung from his broad shoulders. His face was a landscape of pale, rigid scales and deeply set, merciless black eyes. He looked at the broken, bleeding queen standing before him. He did not kneel. He did not salute. "Look at you, guard." Vokhtar's voice boomed a deep synthetic modulation that rattled the loose gravel on the floor. The great sovereign, hiding in a hole like a wounded vermin. Zylara stood tall, forcing her failing spine straight. "Treason carries only one sentence, Vokhtar. You will choke on your own ambition." Vokhtar laughed. It was a cold, mechanical sound. He gestured with a massive, armored hand toward her abdomen. "Treason," Vokhtar sneered. "You dare speak of treason when you carry the ultimate betrayal inside your own flesh. Our medical telemetry tracked the biological anomaly before your transport even crashed. You have allowed your royal blood to be polluted. You have bred with filth." Vokhtar's black eyes snapped away from the queen, scanning the shadows of the cavern. The beam of his shoulder-mounted targeting laser sliced through the dust. It landed squarely on Silas's chest. Silas was slowly pulling himself up from the cavern floor. He wiped a streak of blood from his chin with his scarred left hand. He didn't drop the wrench. Vokhtar stared at the gray-haired, grease-stained human. Disgust rippled across the High Commander's rigid face. "This," Vokhtar hissed, his voice thick with absolute revulsion. "A scavenger, a fragile, pathetic dirt scrubber. You defiled an 11,000-year-old dynasty for a mechanic." Vokhtar raised his massive arm. The heavy plasma cannon mounted on his gauntlet whined as it drew power, a blinding blue light gathering in the barrel. He aimed it directly at Silas's head. "I will vaporize the anomaly," Vokhtar declared, "and then I will sever your head, my queen." Zylara moved. Despite the crushing agony of the accelerated pregnancy, she threw her massive frame forward, raising her spear to intercept the blast, putting her body between the High Commander and the mechanic. "Silas, run!" she roared, her voice tearing. But Silas didn't run. He didn't cower. He looked at Vokhtar. He looked at the heavy, intricate, tactical armor the Solarian giant wore. He looked at the energy shielding, shimmering faintly across the black metal. Silas Thorne was not a soldier. He didn't know how to fight a 9-foot alien warlord in hand-to-hand combat. But Silas was a mechanic, and mechanics knew exactly how things broke. He didn't look at Vokhtar's gun. He looked down at the dented, sputtering quantum heating core sitting between them on the cave floor. The core he had spent the last 12 hours bypassing, rewiring, and stripping of its safety regulators to keep them from freezing. It was a volatile, unshielded reactor. Silas stepped out from behind the queen. He stepped directly into the path of Vokhtar's targeting laser. "Hey!" Silas barked, his voice cutting through the hum of the charging weapon. Vokhtar's black eyes locked onto the human. Silas raised his heavy plasma wrench. He didn't throw it at the giant. He didn't swing at it like a club. He slammed the heavy steel head of the wrench directly into the exposed bypassed relay of the quantum heating core. He didn't hesitate. Not for 3 seconds. Not for a fraction of a millisecond. The wrench bridged the positive and negative quantum terminals. The result was not an explosion of fire. It was an explosion of pure, raw electromagnetism. A silent, blinding dome of white energy erupted from the core, expanding outward at the speed of light. It washed over Silas. It washed over Zalara. And it slammed into Vokhtar and his 50 elite guards like a physical tidal wave. Every piece of advanced Solarian technology in the cavern died instantly. Vokhtar's charging plasma cannons shorted out with a deafening crack, the backfire blowing a chunk of metal off his own gauntlet. The energy shields of the infantry collapsed. The artificial muscle fibers in their heavy tactical armor seized and locked. 50 giant warriors were suddenly trapped inside 2,000 pounds of dead, unyielding metal. The cavern plunged into absolute darkness, save for the faint violet glow of the storm outside. Vokhtar groaned, his massive muscles straining against the locked servos of his dead armor. He was paralyzed from the neck down, frozen in place like a grotesque black statue. Silas slowly stood up. The EMP had fried his wrist display and his shoulder lamp, but he didn't need them. His eyes adjusted to the dim violet light. His left hand was smoking slightly from the electrical discharge, the old scars burning with a fresh, sharp pain. He kept a firm grip on the wrench. He walked slowly across the stone floor. He walked past the frozen, panicked eyes of the elite guards. He walked right up to the paralyzed high commander. Vokhtar's jaw was not locked. He glared down at the human, his black eyes burning with a hatred that defied logic. "A trick!" Vokhtar spat, his voice devoid of the synthetic modulator, revealing a harsh guttural rasp. "A coward's trick. You are nothing human. You are dirt. You hide behind machines. She is a sovereign. You do not even deserve to look upon her." Silas stopped right in front of the giant. He didn't gloat. He didn't offer a witty, triumphant speech. He just looked at the warlord with the tired, uncompromising eyes of a man who had seen too many broken things to be impressed by armor. Silas reached out with his scarred, trembling left hand. He didn't strike the commander. He simply placed his hand on the black metal of Vokhtar's paralyzed chest plate, right over the alien's racing hearts. "I don't see a sovereign," Silas said. The absolute quiet of his voice cut deeper than any shout. "I don't see a queen, or a goddess, or a genetic anomaly." Silas turned his head slowly, looking back over his shoulder at Zalara. She was leaning heavily on her spear, her breathing ragged, her golden eyes wide with shock at the sudden, impossible reversal of their fate. "I just see the woman," Silas continued, his voice steadying, "anchoring itself to the truth in the dark, who laughed at my terrible soup." He turned back to Vokhtar. "And if you ever point a gun at her again, I won't use an EMP. I'll use this wrench to unbolt your skull from your spine. Do you understand how mechanics work now?" Before Vokhtar could spit a reply, the sky outside the cavern tore open. It was not the violet light of the rebel gunships. It was a blinding, brilliant gold. The ground shook so violently that stalactites snapped from the cavern roof and shattered on the floor. The roaring thunder of massive atmospheric entry dropships drowned out the howling wind. The Loyalists had arrived. The encrypted emergency beacon Silas had covertly activated using his ship's black box before hauling the heater away had finally broken through the storm's interference. It had reached the Corward fleet. The generals who had refused to betray their queen had burned their engines to slag to reach this frozen rock. Golden armored shock troops poured into the cavern, their weapons live and targeting the paralyzed rebel forces. But Silas didn't watch the cavalry arrive. He heard a heavy metallic clatter behind him. He spun around. Zalara's spear had hit the stone. The queen of the Solarian Empire was on her knees. Silas sprinted across the cavern, dropping to his knees beside her. He caught her massive shoulders as she pitched forward. Her skin was burning hot, far beyond normal Solarian temperatures. The copper scales were rapidly shifting color, pulsing with a blinding, terrifying internal light. Zylara! Silas gripped her face, his scarred hands terrified of breaking her. Hold on, the medics are coming. Just hold on. She grabbed his forearm. The grip was impossibly strong, driven by pure biological agony. Her golden eyes were dilated, seeing past the cavern, seeing past the physical world. It is time, she gasped, her back arching violently. The loyalist medics rushed into the cavern, carrying heavy trauma gear. But as they approached the queen, they suddenly stopped. They hit an invisible physical wall of energy. The air around Zilara and Silas began to warp. It smelled of ozone, burning copper, and rain. The ambient gravity in a 10-foot radius simply ceased to exist. Loose pebbles floated into the air. Silas didn't let go. He held on to her as the universe seemed to hold its breath. There was no medical procedure. There was no gentle delivery. The biology of an apex predator, combined with the relentless aggressive adaptability of human DNA, did not ask for permission. Zylara threw her head back and let out a sound that was not a scream, but a roar of absolute primal creation. A flash of blinding liquid starlight erupted between them. Silas was thrown backward by the sheer kinetic force of the birth. He hit the cave wall, sliding down his vision, swimming with after images of blue and gold. When his eyes finally cleared, the cavern was dead silent. The floating rocks crashed back to the floor. The loyalist medics cautiously stepped forward. Zylara was lying on the stone. She was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling, the dull gray fading from her scales as her body rapidly began to heal. And resting on her armored chest was the child. It was small compared to a Solarian infant, but massive for a human. It did not cry with the weak, fragile wail of a newborn. The child opened its eyes. They were a piercing, luminescent blue, the exact shade of Silas's eyes, but the irises were set in pools of molten gold. Its skin was soft, lacking the hard scales of its mother, possessing a warm, radiant copper hue. The baby took its first breath, opening its small mouth, and exhaled. It was a soundless cry, a quantum pulse, a ripple of pure biological energy washed outward from the child. It passed through Silas, feeling like a sudden rush of warm wind. It passed through the loyalist troops. It washed over the paralyzed form of High Commander Vokhtar. Every electronic device that had survived the EMP, every medical scanner, every weapon optic, every communication relay in the cavern simultaneously reset. The lights flickered and burned with a fierce, brilliant intensity. The child had not just been born, it had synchronized with the environment. It was a living, breathing bridge between organic life and quantum mechanics. The loyalist commander, a battle-scarred veteran with silver scales, slowly lowered his weapon. He looked at the child. He looked at the impossible blue eyes. He dropped to one knee on the cold stone. Within seconds, the entire cavern of golden armored warriors knelt in absolute reverent silence. Vokhtar, still trapped in his dead armor, watched his rebellion crumble to dust before a creature that was less than a minute old. Silas stayed by the cavern wall. He leaned his head back against the rock. He looked at the child resting on Zylara's chest. He looked at the alien queen who was staring down at her daughter with a look of overwhelming fierce love. Silas felt a profound, heavy ache settle deep in his chest. It was the ache of a man who had finally fixed something that actually mattered. An hour later, the cavern was a hive of organized chaos. Heavy transport shuttles were landing outside, their massive engines melting the glacial ice. Medics were tending to Zylara, running scans, wrapping her in thermal blankets. Loyalist troops were hauling Vokhtar and his rebels away in heavy stasis chains. Silas stood near the shattered entrance of the cave. The storm had broken. The pale, distant sun of the ice planet was rising, casting long, sharp shadows across the frozen wasteland. He had his heavy parka zipped up. He held his battered toolkit in his right hand. He watched a team of royal guards form a protective phalanx around Zylara as she was helped to her feet. She was draped in a heavy crimson cloak, the child swaddled securely against her chest. She looked every inch the sovereign again. She stopped the guards with a raised hand. She turned her head, searching the shadows. She saw him standing by the exit. Zylara stepped away from the phalanx. She walked slowly across the stone, the heavy crimson cloak dragging behind her. She stopped 2 feet from the mechanic. She didn't speak immediately. She looked at his grease-stained face, at the exhaustion etched deep into the lines around his eyes. She looked at his scarred left hand gripping the handle of the toolbox. "The flagship awaits," Zylara said softly, her voice meant only for him. "The medical bays are secure. The Empire's fractured, but the core systems stand with me. You will come with us." Silas looked up at her. He looked into the golden eyes that had stared him down over a broken heating core. He looked at the small, copper-skinned child sleeping against her chest, breathing in a slow, steady rhythm. His heart violently twisted in his chest. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to drop the toolbox, to step onto that ship, to claim the impossible miracle he had helped forge in the dark. But Silas Thorne was a mechanic. He dealt in reality. He dealt in the hard, unforgiving mathematics of how the universe functioned. He knew what would happen if a human mechanic walked up the ramp of the Imperial flagship. He knew what the Solarian High Council would do. They had just barely survived a coup. The Empire was bleeding. If she brought the human father to the capital, well, she would not be a sovereign returning in triumph. She would be a scandal. She would be a target. The Civil War would not end. It would simply change shape, and the child would be in the crosshairs every single day. Love was not always about holding on. Sometimes love was about knowing exactly when to let go to keep the machine running. Silas reached into his deep pocket. He pulled out the heavy iridium medallion, the royal seal. He reached out and gently placed the cold metal into her large, warm hand. He folded her fingers over it. "A mechanic fixes what's broken," Silas said. His voice was incredibly soft, a rough whisper, barely carrying over the sound of the shuttle engines. "Your empire is broken, Zylara. It needs its queen. It doesn't need a grease monkey sitting next to the throne giving the nobles an excuse to start another war." Zylara's eyes widened. A flash of desperate raw pain cracked her imperial mask. "You are the father of the next sovereign," she whispered fiercely. "You fought for me. You bled for me. I command you to board that ship." Silas offered a small, sad smile. He reached up with his scarred left hand. He gently traced the line of her copper cheek. He let his thumb brush the soft, warm head of the sleeping infant. "I'm not very good at following orders," Silas said quietly. "Never was." He stepped back. The physical distance between them opened again. It felt like stepping out of an airlock into the void. "Go fix your universe, Your Majesty," Silas said. "Make it safe for her." Zylara stared at him. The royal guards were waiting. The Empire was waiting. She knew the brutal, agonizing logic of his words. She knew the sacrifice he was making to ensure her survival and the survival of their child. She did not cry. Solarians did not weep. But she bowed her head, a deep, profound gesture of absolute respect that no human had ever received in the history of the cosmos. "I see you, Silas Thorne," she whispered. She turned. She walked up the ramp of the heavily armored transport. She did not look back. If she looked back, she knew she would never leave. Silas watched the massive ships lift off on pillars of blue fire. He stood in the freezing wind, pulling his collar tight against the chill, watching the contrails disappear into the upper atmosphere until the sky was nothing but an empty pale blue. He picked up his toolbox. He turned around and began the long walk toward the United States Space Command outpost beacon 300 miles to the south. He was entirely alone again. But for the first time in 30 years, his left hand didn't ache. 5 years later, the heat of the forge was a physical entity in the small open-air workshop. The air smelled of burning coal-hot iron and the dry red dust of the frontier planet of Aegis Prime. Silas Thorne brought the heavy hammer down on the glowing steel. Clank. He turned the metal with his tongs. He brought the hammer down again. Clank. He was 63 years old. His hair was entirely white now, tied back with a grease-stained leather strap. He wore a heavy leather apron over a thick canvas shirt. The scars on his left arm were still there, but they no longer bothered him. He swung the hammer with the steady, measured rhythm of a man who had found his peace in the simple, undeniable truth of shaping metal. A shadow fell over the anvil. Silas didn't look up immediately. The outpost was a quiet place. Mostly farmers, traders, people who wanted to be left alone by the core worlds. He assumed it was Old Man Higgins needing a new axle for his atmospheric harvester. I told you, Higgins, it won't be ready until Tuesday, Silas grunted, raising the hammer again. My name is not Higgins. The voice was young, high-pitched, but it carried an unnerving melodic resonance. It spoke perfect, unaccented English, but the underlying harmonic vibration was undeniably alien. Silas froze. The hammer hovered midair. He slowly lowered the tool. He turned around. Standing in the doorway of his dusty workshop was a child. She was 5 years old, but she stood nearly 5 feet tall, the height of a human teenager. She wore a simple, rugged tunic woven from fine, dark material. Her skin was a beautiful, radiant copper, lacking the hard scales of a full-blooded Solarian, smooth and flawless. Her hair was a shock of thick, dark bronze braided back in a warrior's knot. And her eyes, they were a piercing, luminescent blue, set deep within pools of molten gold. Silas felt the breath leave his lungs. He dropped the tongs. The glowing piece of steel hit the dirt floor, hissing softly. The girl looked at him. She looked at his grease-stained face. She looked at his scarred left hand. She didn't look afraid. She looked incredibly, intensely curious. She walked forward into the shop. Her boots made no sound on the dirt floor. She stepped up to the massive iron anvil. She reached into a small satchel slung across her shoulder. She pulled out a dented aluminum tin. It was a United States Space Command standard-issue emergency ration. Meat stew. She carefully placed the tin on the flat surface of the anvil, right next to Silas's heavy hammer. Mother says, the little girl spoke, her blue-gold eyes locking onto Silas's face, that this is the worst thing she has ever tasted in her entire life. Silas stared at the tin. He stared at the little girl. The massive, immovable weight he had carried in his chest for 5 long, quiet years suddenly fractured, breaking apart like ice in the spring sun. He let out a short, rough breath. A tired, brilliant smile cracked the dirt on his face. A second shadow fell across the doorway, blocking out the red sun of Aegis Prime. Silas looked up. Zylara stood in the entrance of the forge. She was not wearing heavy combat armor. She was not wearing the heavy, suffocating robes of the Imperial Court. She wore a simple, dark traveling cloak. Her copper hair flowed freely over her shoulders. She was still 8 feet tall. She was still a Titan. But her golden eyes were soft. They were entirely fixed on the mechanic standing by the anvil. The Empire is stable, Zylara said quietly, her deep voice vibrating through the warm air of the workshop. The rebellion is crushed. The Council has accepted the new lineage. The Sovereign has secured her throne. She stepped into the shop, the sheer presence of her making the small space feel suddenly vast. And the Sovereign decided, Zylara continued, a small knowing smile touching the corners of her mouth, that she requires a chief engineer, someone who knows how to fix broken things. Silas looked at the little girl standing by the anvil, her hand resting gently on the tin of terrible soup. He looked at the alien queen who had crossed the galaxy to find a dusty forge on the edge of nowhere. He didn't bow. He didn't salute. Silas Thorne reached out with his scarred left hand. He picked up his heavy hammer. He wiped his greasy brow with his forearm. Well, Silas said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in a lifetime. You better come in then. It's getting cold outside. The little girl smiled, a bright, radiant expression that made the lights in the workshop flicker and hum with sudden, joyous energy. Zylara closed the distance, her massive hand reaching out to gently cover Silas's scarred fingers resting on the anvil. Outside, the red sun set over the quiet frontier. But inside the forge, the fire was burning bright, and the universe was finally exactly where it was supposed to be.